The Voss Armada came without declaration, without ultimatum, without so much as a radio burst to warn the 6 billion people who happened to be standing on the surface of Earth when the first transit flash split the sky above the North Atlantic. They came in 17 city-sized vessels arranged in a parabolic formation that human mathematicians would later calculate was the Voss equivalent of a shrug. A lazy, contemptuous arc that said, "We are not a military force. We are a collection agency." The Voss did not conquer. The Voss repossessed. They had been doing it to planets for 300 years, and in all that time, no species had ever given them more than token resistance. Why would they? The Voss were 3 meters tall on average, encased in living ceramic armor that grew from their skin like a second skeleton, and they could see in 17 distinct electromagnetic bands simultaneously. They also had a biological adaptation that the Voss considered their greatest gift, and humanity would come to regard as their single exploitable weakness. They perceived time in perfect, immutable sequence. To a Voss, what had happened, what was happening was happening, and what had not yet happened simply did not exist. Causality was their religion, their physics, and their cage. They had no word for do-over. Sergeant Mara Voss, no relation. Though the coincidence of the name would later seem like the universe's idea of a joke, was not supposed to be the one who figured it out. She was, by her own admission, the frank assessment of 2 commanding officers whose reports she had personally read, a person of intermittent motivation, considerable improvisational ability, and a stubborn attachment to finishing things that other people had already written off as finished. She had grown up in Jersey, specifically in that particular part of Jersey, where ambition is regarded with mild suspicion, and getting by is considered an art form. She was 29. She had been a sergeant for 8 months. She had been awake for 37 consecutive hours when the transit flash lit her window at 0400, and she pulled on her boots before she'd even made a conscious decision to do so. Boots were the first thing. That was how she'd always been. The boots went on, and then you figured out where you were going. She was billeted at Fort Drum in upstate New York, which placed her approximately 600 kilometers from the nearest landing zone, but directly under the secondary communications blackout that spread from the Voss vessels like a radio eclipse. Every screen in the barracks went to static simultaneously. Every phone went dark. The emergency klaxon ran for 45 seconds and then stopped, which was its own kind of message. Mara laid her boots, woke her squadmate Des with a foot shove to the cot frame and said, "Something's happening." "Something's been happening," Des said. She was already pulling over her head. Earl Desiree Okonkwo, 26, from Atlanta, who had joined the Army for the same reason Mara had. She couldn't think of anything better, and she wanted to see what she was made of. They had been friends for 3 years. In the way soldiers become friends, which is to say they had seen each other afraid, and neither had mentioned it. They were on the motor pool tarmac in under 4 minutes. It was cold. The sky above the tree line was wrong, not dark, exactly, but wrong in the way a face is wrong when the eyes are open but nothing is looking out. Then one of the ships moved, just slightly, repositioning in the stratosphere, and the reflected light from its hull swept across the base like a slow searchlight. And Mara saw all the small shapes of her colleagues frozen in that same posture. Heads tilted back, mouths open a little, trying to understand something that their cognitive equipment had not been designed to process. She looked at Des. Des looked at her. "Boots are on," Des said. "Yeah," Mara said. What followed was 6 days of controlled chaos, or what the Army called controlled chaos, which means the chaos was thoroughly documented. The Voss made no aggressive moves in those first 6 days. They had no need to. They simply held position at 8 distinct altitudes above every major population center on Earth and broadcast a single signal on every radio frequency simultaneously. A mathematical sequence that any civilization capable of detecting it could decode, and which decoded "your world is in arrears. Represent the authority. Compliance is requested. Non-compliance is noted." The UN Security Council convened. Various world leaders made various statements. 12 nations scrambled fighter jets, which accomplished nothing except to confirm what the physicists were already calculating from radar returns. The Voss hulls, were impervious to anything humanity had manufactured. The jets were not destroyed, they were ignored, which was somehow worse. On day 7, a Voss landing party came down. They came in a single transport, a teardrop of dark ceramic that set down in the middle of a Kansas wheat field, with the calm precision of something that had landed in 1,000 wheat fields on 1,000 worlds. 8 Voss stepped out. They wore no weapons that human eyes could identify, though analysts would later determine that the forearm ridges on Voss bodies functioned as directed energy emitters capable of turning organic matter to vapor at 50 meters. They walked toward the nearest town. They walked slowly. They did not walk like they were concerned about anything that might be waiting for them. Mara watched this on a laptop that someone had rigged to a civilian satellite feed, the only real-time imagery available. She was in a forward staging area in Ohio, part of a rapid response unit that had been repositioned 3 times in 6 days in response to intelligence assessments that were, she had concluded, essentially guesses. "What do they want?" Des asked, not really asking anyone. "They said it in the broadcast," said the captain, a man named Harlow who had the deep, permanent weariness of someone who had been awake too long and was too disciplined to show it. Ears. This planet owes something. To who? Nobody answered that. The Voss party walked into the town. They examined things. They picked objects up and put them down. They appeared to be conducting an inventory. One of them stopped at a gas station and stood in front of the unleaded pump for 4 minutes, which later became one of the most analyzed clips of footage from the first contact period, because the analyst eventually determined the Voss was not confused by the pump. It was listening to the radio playing inside the station. The song was something from the 80s, something with a synthesizer. The Voss stood there and listened to the whole thing. Then they walked back to their transport and left. This happened 18 more times over the next 12 days in 18 different locations across 6 continents. Same pattern: land, walk, inventory, leave, no violence, no communication beyond the initial broadcast. The analysts called it assessment. Mara called it what it looked like. They were doing a walkthrough before making an offer. On day 22, the offer came. The Voss communication was clean, mathematical, efficient. Your world's biosphere represents resource classification Tier 7, under the Authority Compact of 2,847 standard years prior. Extraction will proceed over the following 40 standard cycles. Your population will be relocated to processing centers for labor assignment. Resistance will delay but not prevent compliance. 40 standard cycles. The mathematicians worked it out fast. Roughly 80 Earth years, 2 generations. Everyone alive on Earth had just been told they had 80 years. The fighting started immediately. It went badly. Not catastrophically, not at first. Humanity had enough nuclear material to make the Voss hesitant about orbital bombardment. And the Voss, it turned out, were not fighters in the way humans were fighters. They were operators. They were efficient, methodical, and nearly impossible to hurt. They were also not particularly imaginative. They had a plan. They executed the plan. When the plan met unexpected variables, they adjusted the plan. But the adjustments were always orderly, always logical, always precisely what you would predict once you understood how they thought. And that was the thing about the Voss. They thought in straight lines. Mara was in the 3rd month of open combat when she found the canister. Unit had been running interdiction operations in what used to be Western Pennsylvania, working out of a network of underground staging areas dug by local construction equipment operators who had repurposed their entire fleet in the first week of the war. The Voss called this noncompliance. Mara called it Tuesday. She had been awake again for a long stretch, and she had developed a routine. Sleep in 4-hour blocks, eat whatever was available, run the next operation, repeat. The routine was not comfortable, but it was sustainable. And in a war against beings who thought in straight lines, sustainability was a strategy. The canister was in a collapsed farmhouse that her unit had been using as a waypoint. It was the size of a thermos of some material that wasn't quite metal and wasn't quite ceramic, with a ridged mouthpiece at one end. It had markings on the side that the unit's analyst identified as consistent with Voss glyphic notation, the kind used for personal items rather than military equipment. Not a weapon, not a tool. Something personal, something one of them had left behind. Mara turned it over in her hands. It was lighter than it looked. When she pressed the ridged mouthpiece experimentally, nothing happened. She handed it to the analyst, Corporal Way, who ran it through every scanner they had. The material was inert. The markings were consistent with Voss' personal notation, but didn't match anything in the captured intelligence database. The interior contained a compressed gas of some kind, organic compounds, trace particulates. Nothing immediately identifiable as dangerous. "Throw it in the hazard bin," said Captain Harlow. Mara put it in her jacket pocket instead. She wasn't sure why. It was the same instinct that had made her put her boots on before she decided anything. Something happened. So you moved. That night, in the 4-hour block that was supposed to be sleep, she lay on a cot in the dark and turned the canister over in her hands and thought about straight lines. The Voss perceived time in sequence. Every analyst had confirmed this by now. Every adaptation, every tactic they used was based on perfect forward momentum. Assess, plan, execute, adjust, execute again. They didn't repeat themselves because repetition was inefficiency. Once a thing had happened, it had happened. You moved forward. You never went back. She pressed the mouthpiece again. This time she held it for 2 full seconds. World blinked. That was the only word for it. Everything present, the cot, the dark, the distant sound of something moving on the surface, subtracted itself, cleanly and completely, like a sentence erased from a page, and then rewrote itself from scratch. Same room, same dark, same sounds. She was at the start of the 4-hour block again. Not halfway through it, and the canister was in her hand, and she was 4 minutes younger than she had been when she pressed it. She sat up very carefully. She checked the time. She was right. 4 minutes back, she pressed the canister again. The world rewrote itself. 3 minutes earlier this time. She was sitting on the cot before she'd laid down, and the canister was in her hand, and she was looking at the far wall. "Hey," said Des from the next cot, and Mara flinched hard. "You okay?" she said. "What time is it?" Des told her. It was 4 minutes earlier than her last version of now. Mara sat with this information for a long time. She had found something the Voss would not have left intentionally. This wasn't equipment. This was something closer to what a soldier carries in a breast pocket. The thing that gets you through. And whatever the Voss used it for, it did something that the Voss biology, the Voss physics, the Voss religion would never have allowed them to build. It let you go back. She didn't tell Harlow. She tested it first, alone in small increments, 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 11 minutes on the longest test, which left her with a headache that she rated a 4 out of 10. Manageable. She tested its range by pressing it while 30 meters from where she'd been. It brought her back to the same point in time but to her current location, meaning the device moved in time but not space. She tested it on objects, holding Des's canteen. When she pressed it left the canteen in the past. The canister moved through time with her, and nothing else. She developed a map of its limits. It could go back as far as she'd been awake in the current operational cycle. Anything beyond that and pressing it resulted in nothing, not even a blink. The further back she went, the larger the headache, but the scale was gradual. She could manage 20 minutes without significant degradation. 30 minutes put her at a 6 out of 10, which was the upper range of acceptable. Beyond 40 she hadn't tested yet. She told Des on a Tuesday, 12 days after finding the canister. Des was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Does it work on them?" Mara hadn't tested that. They tested it on a Thursday, during a contact engagement with a 4 Voss patrol that had been tracking their relay station position. Patrol came in from the north as expected. Mara's unit engaged. The first exchange went badly. 2 of their people took hits, not fatal but serious, and the patrol advanced faster than the projections had suggested. Mara pressed the canister. The world rewrote. The patrol was back at its original position, moving south. 2 colleagues were unhurt. The engagement had not happened yet. She made different decisions. The second version went better. The patrol was neutralized, all 4 Voss, with no casualties on Mara's side. When it was over, she sat in the rubble of a Pennsylvania farmhouse and breathed very carefully and thought about what she was holding. "We need to tell command," Des said. "We need to understand it first," Mara said. Because the second we tell command, it becomes a strategic asset and they'll use it the wrong way. What's the wrong way? Big, Mara said. Dramatic. One massive operation with a lot of do-overs until they get it right. And that'll work until it doesn't. And then we won't have it anymore. She was right about this. And she knew it the way you know things that you can't fully explain yet, but can feel in the machinery of your thinking. The vase moved in straight lines. The canister let you bend time back like a wire. If you used it too big, too loud, they would adapt. They'd see the pattern. Events happening twice, outcomes changing, and they wouldn't know why, but they'd reinforce, redirect, add variables. The vase could not imagine going back in time, but they could absolutely notice when reality seemed to have glitched. What you had to do was use it small, surgical. Countless small operations over months, each one tight and precise. Each reversal invisible, the new outcomes slightly different from what the vase had planned, but never different enough to seem impossible. You had to make them doubt their own assessments, rather than suspect an external cause. You had to make their perfect straight-line thinking run into walls it couldn't explain. She laid this out for Des over the next 3 days, working it out in stages. The way you work out something that doesn't have a name yet. You're going to get them to doubt, Des said. I'm going to get them to second-guess themselves, Mara said. First time in 300 years, something isn't going according to plan. Not dramatically, not planet-wide. Just here, just in this sector. A patrol that should have secured a position doesn't. And a relay array they mapped yesterday isn't where they recorded it. An ambush they prepared for springs from the wrong angle, because we already knew their setup, and we ran the approach again from scratch. Des looked at her. You know this is insane. Most good plans are. It started small the way she'd designed it. Their sector, a swath of western Pennsylvania, running from the old river towns up into the ridgelines, became the quietest sector in the theater. Not because the vase stopped operating there. They operated heavily. Their operations kept encountering outcomes that didn't match predictions. The analytical teams the vase deployed to explain the discrepancies produced reports that contradicted each other, because the discrepancies weren't caused by any single variable. Mara used the canister judiciously, never more than once per day, never more than 20 minutes back. She kept it under 20, because she'd tested 30 twice now, and the headache had been bad enough that she'd had to sit still for 2 hours afterward. Which, in a combat zone, is a liability she could not sustain. The vase began reinforcing the sector. More patrols. More surveillance drones. Their equivalents, anyway. Biological constructs that moved like drifting seeds and registered heat signatures. The reinforcement was the plan working, not failing. She needed them to concentrate resources in her sector. She needed them dense. Captain Harlow noticed something was different 3 months in. He noticed what any competent officer would notice. His sector was performing above expectation without any obvious tactical reason. He called Mara into his command space. A former root seller with 3 laptop screens and a hand-drawn map on the wall, and asked her directly how they were doing it. She told him. He sat with it. He was that kind of officer. The kind who sits with things, who doesn't rush to a reaction. He asked her about limitations. She told him everything she'd mapped. He asked her if she'd considered what would happen when the canister ran out. She'd considered it constantly. She had no idea what the vase used as fuel, or how full it had been when she found it. There was no visible indicator. Every press felt the same as the first. You should have told me immediately, he said finally. Yes, sir. Why didn't you? Because I needed to know what it was before anyone decided what it was for. He thought about this. "Okay," he said. "What's it for?" She told him what she'd been building toward. She'd been running small, tight reversals in one sector. She had been, very carefully, using those reversals not just to win engagements, but to gather intelligence she shouldn't have. In a first run of an encounter, she would let the engagement play out further than tactically advisable. Far enough to watch the vase communication patterns, their fallback positions, their procedural responses to unexpected resistance. She cataloged everything. Then she rewound and ran the engagement with that intelligence, winning cleanly. For 6 months, she had built a near-complete picture of vase operational doctrine. in a way that no surveillance operation could have produced, because she had been present at both the Voss decision-making and the outcome simultaneously. "We have a roadmap," she said. "Not for winning the war, not with one canister, but we know exactly what they'll do, under every condition we've been able to test. And, more importantly, we know where their doctrine breaks. We know the 2 or 3 types of situations that their straight-line thinking genuinely cannot process, where road just ends for them." Harlow looked at the map on the wall, telling me that one person with one stolen alien artifact has spent 6 months building an intelligence picture that our entire strategic analysis division doesn't have. "I had an advantage," Mara said. "You had a lot of advantages," Harlow said. He almost smiled. "You also had a headache for 6 months. I've had worse." The debrief that followed was classified at a level Mara didn't have clearance for. She was in the room anyway. Intelligence was too specific to hand off cleanly without her present to contextualize it. What she watched, over 36 hours in a former FEMA bunker in Ohio that had been repurposed as a joint command post, was the moment when the information she'd gathered started to become strategy. Started to become, slowly and carefully, something that could actually end this. The key insight was about their communication. Voss doctrine in a failing sector was to escalate in clean increments. Double the patrol density, then add surveillance architecture, then bring in what they called a correction vessel. A smaller ship not for bombardment, but for precision suppression, landing additional infantry in structured patterns. The doctrine was tight, and it worked. Space, what it assumed was the failing sector was failing because of external resource pressure, because of things happening to the Voss. It had no protocol for a failing sector that was failing because of something the Voss couldn't identify, something invisible, something that had already happened once and was being made to unhappen. The command team designed an operation. Mara walked them through its architecture 3 times. She was very clear about what she could and could not do. She was very clear about the constraint she had operated under for 6 months. Use it small, use it quiet. Let the Voss's own certainty work against them. The command team initially wanted to use it large, to run a massive reversal that would buy them a window to deploy a weapon. A strike, something dramatic. She pushed back hard. "They'll see it," she said. "Not the mechanism, but the result. An operation of this scale can't unhappen without leaving traces, logistical ghosts. Witnesses who remember things differently. The Voss may not understand time reversal, but they are extraordinary record keepers. They will find the seam." "So what do? "We don't reverse time," Mara said. "We just use what I know. I've already run this sector 6 months of do-overs. I know what they'll do before they do it. We don't need to reset anything at the operational level. Just need to put the right people in the right places with the right information and let them move forward." This was, the command team recognized, the kind of simple that takes a very long time to arrive at. The operation ran over 9 days. Mara's role was advisory and positional. She placed herself in the field, because the canister only worked in the field, because it was for emergencies, because 9 days of doing something you'd mapped 6 months of intelligence toward was still 9 days of things going sideways in small ways. It went sideways 4 times. She used the canister twice, both times minor, under 10 minutes each, clean reversals, headache both times kept below a 5. The other 2 times the sideways was manageable without reversal, because she'd run enough first attempts in this sector to know what manageable looked like. The result was not a battle. The Voss didn't call it a battle either, though their own post-incident documentation, captured much later, translated over years, used a phrase that the xenolinguistics teams translated as unexpected systemic dissonance, which was as close as their language could get to saying something didn't make sense. Correction vessel they dispatched to the Pennsylvania sector, responding to exactly the pattern of escalating anomalies Mara's unit had been generating for 6 months, was directed into a corridor of terrain that looked clear on all their sensor arrays because Mara's people had spent 3 weeks preceding the operation doing absolutely nothing observable in that corridor. The vessel's landing zone was, by Voss doctrine, a textbook safe approach. It was a textbook safe approach, for the same reason their doctrine had been failing for months. They were working from a straight line, and the ground had a curve in it that they couldn't see. The vessel came down. The vessel did not leave. Mara was on a ridgeline 3 kilometers out. She watched the operation through binoculars, which was low-tech and deliberate. She'd learned in 6 months of testing that what you knew was worth more than what you could see. His was next to her. The distant thump of the detonation sequence reached them 8 seconds after the light. Quiet and late. The way all big sounds arrive when you're far enough away to be safe. Done, Dead said. Mara lowered the binoculars. The Voss command hierarchy would take time to process the loss. They would analyze. They would query the surviving sensor data, find no answers, query again. They would look at 6 months of anomalous outcomes in one sector and try to fit it into a framework where all causes are known and all effects are predictable. And the world moves in one direction only. They would not find a framework that fit. What they would find, over the months following, was that the dissonance spread. Not because Mara's sector was special, because the intelligence she had cataloged was disseminated, carefully and specifically, to other units, in other sectors. Not the canister. That stayed with her, and she used it exactly 3 more times before it stopped responding, sitting quiet in her hand one cold morning in February, like something that had said its piece. The doctrine map, the breakdown points, the 2 or 3 situations where their straight-line thinking ran into the curve. Those were reproducible without any technology at all. Humans had been running tabletop exercises with incomplete information and finding unexpected solutions since before they had a word for tactics. What Mara had given them was the information that made those solutions reliable. It took 4 years. She would not oversell this or pretend otherwise. 4 years of sustained, grinding, expensive resistance, and the human cost was real, and she carried it specifically, the way you carry specific things when you've seen them close up. The arc of it bent in one direction, and the Voss, whose doctrine had never encountered a species that would do something twice, kept meeting resistance that had no explanation in the framework they had brought to this world. They adapted. Of course they adapted. They were not fools and they were not cartoons. They brought new ships, new procedures, new analytical frameworks. They doubled their surveillance architecture and tripled their communication encryption. They did everything their considerable intelligence suggested they should do. It wasn't enough. Not because humanity was superior. Mara would have hit anyone who said that, and she had said so on record twice during the war, and once to a journalist who used the quote out of context. It wasn't enough because the Voss had a blind spot baked into their biology, their history, and their certainty. They lived in a universe where time had one direction and consequences were permanent. They had built everything on that foundation. And in western Pennsylvania, in the winter of the 3rd year of the war, a sergeant from Jersey had found a small canister left behind by one of them, and had understood something the Voss had never had to think about. Because you only think about water when you're not swimming in it. They left. Not all at once. Not with fanfare. The Voss withdrawal was as methodical as their arrival. And it took 18 months. And there were operations during those 18 months that Mara would have done differently with more time and fewer constraints. And she thought about those operations sometimes at night. But they left. The 17 city-sized vessels transited out of orbit in a parabolic arc that human mathematicians noted was the Voss equivalent of tabling a matter for future review. Surrender, not concession, just, this is not resolving according to projection. We will recalculate. Mara heard about it on the radio. She was in a base camp in Ohio. Not Fort Drum, not where she'd started, but close enough in spirit. And the announcement came over a civilian broadcast that someone had rigged to a battery array in the mess area. And the whole space went quiet the way spaces go quiet when something has shifted and everyone knows it, but no one is ready to say it out loud yet. She sat with her. She thought about the canister which she had not carried since the day it stopped working. She had left it in a gear bag in a storage facility in Pittsburgh, tagged and logged as alien artifact, personal use classification, category unknown. She thought about the first time she'd pressed it. The way the world had blinked. The way she'd sat up in the dark and held very still while she worked out what had just happened to the rules. Des sat down next to her with her own coffee fee. "We won," Des said, like she was testing the words out. "We didn't lose," Mara said, which was more accurate and felt more honest and was also the most Jersey thing she'd ever said in her life. It was a real laugh, tired and complicated and real. Outside, through the open side of the mess tent, the sky was the ordinary February gray of Ohio. Clouds moving east at whatever speed clouds moved. No wrong-colored light from a hull above the tree line. Just sky. Just the ordinary, useless, beautiful, indifferent sky. Mara finished her coffee. She thought. The boots went on. "And then you figured out where you were going," she thought. They had no word for do-over. She thought, "We were made of do-overs. We were built from do-overs." Every good thing a human being had ever managed had started as a first attempt that didn't work. And a stubbornness about trying again. The Voss had looked at this planet and seen resources, seen compliance waiting to happen, seen a species without armor and without the ability to see in 17 electromagnetic bands. They had not seen what was actually the most dangerous thing about the people standing on the surface. They had not seen that we would do this as many times as it took, that we would burn through the night and mess up the approach and lose people we cared about and go back to the start and do it again and again and again. Not because we were fearless, but because we had been doing it since before we had ships, since before we had guns, since before we had fire. Standing in the dark with something we'd found that we didn't fully understand yet, pressing the thing that made the world blink, and sitting up and thinking, "Okay, let's try that differently." She set down her coffee cup. She stood up. "What are you doing?" Des asked. "Going to find something useful to do," Mara said. "The war just ended. That means the work starts." She pulled on her jacket. She walked out of the mess tent into the Ohio gray. The ground was half frozen. Soft in some places and hard in others. The way ground gets when winter can't make up its mind. She walked north, toward the motor pool, toward the part of the base where people would already be meeting to figure out what came next. Behind her, inside the tent, the radio was still going. Someone had switched it from the news feed to a music channel. Something with a synthesizer. Something old. Something from the 80s. The kind of song that had no real reason to be as good as it was. She didn't look back. She kept walking. The boots were on.